Shabbat Shalom, everybody, and happy Simchat Torah. Let's begin our program this evening with Lecha Dodi. As the sun descends and the shadows lengthen, the distractions of the day give way to the stillness of night. It is time now for us to see not with our eyes, but with our hearts and minds. As the day gives way to evening, it is time for us to welcome Shabbat. May these candles that we are about to light reflect the light in our lives and the warmth we find in our sense of community. Though we are physically apart, may their light spark a sense of real connection. Ask Arthur to light the candles. Baruch ha'or ba'olam, Baruch ha'or ba'adam, Baruch ha'or ba'shalom, Ba'shalom, Baruch ha'or, Baruch ha'or, Ba'shabbat u'vayom tov. Raise your glasses if you have them, as we'll say a l'chaim, a Shabbat Shalom, and a Chag Sameach. A reading. May we keep something beautiful in our hearts to survive difficult times and enjoy good times. May we experience each day as a sacred gift woven around the heart of wonder. May we live each day compassionate of heart, clear in word, gracious in awareness, courageous in thought, generous in love. Blessed be the gifts we never notice, our health, eyes to behold the world, thoughts to countenance the unknown, memory to harvest vanished days, our heart to feel the world's waves, our breath to breathe the nourishment of distance made intimate by earth. Though we are betrothed to the unknown, let us at the end of each day give thanks for being. We continue with Afo Ori. Tonight, I'm going to devote a significant amount of our time together to talking about Simchat Torah and primarily about the importance of the Torah or an appreciation of the Torah from a humanistic Jewish point of view. I want to share this graphic that Arthur's about to put up on the screen here. I'll get out of its way a little bit. This was something after I laid out the Torah last week and it was sitting in the meeting room at our congregation. I got this text from Anne-Marie Fisher, our executive director. She said, "Are you done with the Torah?" And I was feeling a little bit cheeky, and I said, "Yeah, we're through." We had words. Apparently, it's against homosexuality and quite misogynistic, TBH, to be honest. Also, there's a lot of bloodshed. So yes, I would say we're done. Now, in my attempt at humor there, I was reflecting something very real, which is, why aren't humanistic Jews done with the Torah? Well, we're going to explore that and a lot of other parts of this topic tonight. The text exchange that I had with Anne-Marie represents the essence of the problem for humanistic Jews. How do we take something that is so revered, so reverenced by so many Jews seriously when it has so many problems? Well, first, we're going to take a little detour to talk about the holiday of Simchat Torah. In the wake of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we just finished Sukkot. Sukkot, at the end, is concluded with yet another holiday called Shmini Atzeret. That's what's beginning tonight and celebrated through tomorrow and indeed through Sunday, as we'll see in a moment. Shmini Atzeret is translated as the 8th day of assembly, a day which, as it is celebrated nowadays, offers us literally nothing special to do, or eat for that matter. There's no special foods, there's no special rituals. There's some prayers for rain in the land of Israel, but that's about it. Now, I don't have any proof of this, but I always like to joke that this month of Tishrei, this month that contains Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot, and Shmini Atzeret, Simchat Torah, as we'll talk about the connection in a moment, may perhaps have been the result of some kind of evil contest, something to dare people to come up with a way that their lives could be disrupted at the maximum throughout the month. And of course, if you're an observant Jew, this is a lot of days to take off, unless you get lucky, as we are this particular month or year, by them falling on weekends. But of course, no, like everything else in Judaism, it's the result of some evolution. If you joined us on Rosh Hashanah, we talked about the evolution of the high holidays, and they are a much later development. Sukkot, Shmini Atzeret, as its little appendix, these go much further back to the agricultural origins of the Israelite people. But what about Simchat Torah? Where does this come from? It's actually one of our newer holidays, perhaps as recent, and this is recent in Jewish history, as 1600 years old. At some point in the diaspora, and we know that this happened in the diaspora, this desperately boring holiday of Shmini Atzeret ran into yet another problem, besides its being boring and having nothing to do, and that is the very complicated legal requirement in Jewish law anyway, that we add an additional day to many of our holidays. Well, here we had now 2 useless days of a superfluous Shmini Atzeret holiday. So what happens is the rabbis of that time got creative and decided that at least one of them, it's usually the 9th one, or the extra day, though they have complications now in Israel where they don't add that day. Well, that one was going to be turned into a brand new holiday about the Torah. We know this happened in the diaspora because we have a little bit of a hint from history. Back in the land of Israel, the custom was to read the entire cycle of the Torah, that is to say from Genesis to Deuteronomy, over a 3-year period. This was called the triennial cycle. In the diaspora, the custom was, as it is today everywhere, to begin and end this reading around the time of the new year. And indeed, that's what happens everywhere now. Now, having this boring nothing holiday with its additional appendage, they decided to devote, at least the appendage in most places, to the celebration of that cycle, to end the reading of Deuteronomy and immediately begin the Torah's reading again with Genesis and in the beginning. So that's Simchat Torah in a nutshell. Well, what about the Torah itself? Well, Jews, as we know, traditionally place a lot of ritual and other interest in the Torah, both in its contents and particularly in services on the scroll itself. In most synagogues, really every synagogue except in our movement, and even some in our movement, it's kept inside a ritual ark. There's a everlasting light above it. There are all kinds of rituals involved with removing it from the Torah, with removing it from the ark, with putting it back in the ark. It is paraded around the synagogue. People kiss it with their talis, their prayer shawl, or with their prayer book, or sometimes their hand. And there's a great deal of ritual in how it's read. I was going to share a video, but this is getting long enough. But I wanted to show you how they lift up the Torah at the end, hold it out for everyone to see in my in-frame, turn it around so you can see all of the words, and then point at it and sing these words, V'zot haTorah asher sam Moshe lifnei v'nei Yisrael al pi Adonai biyad Moshe. So what does this mean? It means this is the scroll of the Torah, or the Torah, that was given unto Israel by the word of God into the hands of Moses. So for most Jews, aside from our movement, the Torah is obviously something that is more than human literature. It is the symbol of Jewish heritage, of Jewish wisdom. For many Orthodox Jews, though not all, the idea that it was given explicitly by God is very real to them. But the same special relationship exists in our other theistic denominations, in Reformed, Conservative, even in Reconstructionism, where they perform really the exact same rituals. But how do they reconcile what they know, that it is human literature, with the fact that they're doing this? Well, it requires some amount of mental gymnastics. I want to share with you something that was written by Rabbi David Wolpe. If you don't know him, he's a very famous conservative rabbi out in Los Angeles. He was once called by Newsweek America's most influential rabbi. He actually rose to fame because during a Passover season, almost 20 years ago, I believe, he announced at a service during that time of the year that the story of the Exodus was, as every academic knows, a complete and total fiction. And I thought this was very brave of him, and I became a fan until he wound up spending really the rest of his career unwinding and more or less backtracking that statement. So let's listen to what he wrote, although he's a conservative rabbi, in the Reform Judaism magazine just a few years ago. This is how he and most Reform and conservative rabbis deal with the Torah. And I'll give my own little gloss on it when I'm done. So what does he write? He says, the Torah is not a book we turn to for historical accuracy. Well, so far so good. But rather for larger truth. The story of the Exodus, he writes, lives in us. Standing at the Passover Seder, I see in my mind's eye the Israelites marching out of Egypt, the miracles at the sea, the pillar of fire leading them through the fearful night. I feel an enormous gratitude, he says, to God. For although we cannot know exactly how God saved our people, we have been saved. Despite unimaginable odds and opposition, the Jewish people have seen nation after nation buried under the debris of history while our nation lives. Here is where archaeology, history, scholarship, and scripture meet. Am Yisrael Chai, the nation of Israel, remains alive. So in a kind of a cheeky little way, I have my own translation from Wolpe's into Jeffy's. Here's what I think he's saying. It doesn't matter that the Exodus didn't happen because I believe in God, and Jews exist. So obviously, God saved them. And now, allow me to wrap it all up by placing the Torah in a list of things that we can all agree are completely reliable sources of accurate evidenced information and truth like archaeology, history, and scholarship. You noticed how he did that. Because if they're all in the same sentence, then that must mean that they're all equally reliable. And then he concludes, Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel lives. Well, this is just a mix of platitudes and ideas about where truth comes from that really do not meet each other very well or measure up in the same way. To say that Torah is not true in the sense that it's historically accurate, but is true with some kind of capital T because it preserves timeless truth, is to gloss over the fact that among these timeless truths are commands to kill people who break Shabbat, murder homosexuals, forcibly marry off-rape victims, execute adulterers, and many others, slaughter children and mothers in wartime. And, of course, I could go on and on. So, how is it that a book can endure as a symbol of eternal wisdom at the expense of ignoring its content? This is a book that endorses slavery, misogyny, rape, genocide, homophobia. Why are they dancing with it? Well, frankly, if I could answer that, I would still be one of them, a conventional rabbi, lifting up the Torah every week at my services. But when I came to humanistic Judaism, it wasn't enough for me simply to acknowledge that the way that it had been seen by me and still is by my colleagues in those movements, I needed to adopt for myself some kind of new way of thinking about it because I love the Torah. I really do. But I don't love it the way that they love it, and I don't talk about it the way that they talk about it. It's not how humanistic Jews view it. Where is there a path towards appreciation of the Torah for us? Well, a few ways we can look at it and think about it. Well, first of all, it's our foundational mythology, and it's a pretty complex mythology of that. The Torah, and in fact, all the books of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, they really do address major issues of the times that they were compiled, and at which they were transmitted. They talk about power struggles and international issues and intimate issues of domestic and other kinds of personal affairs. They provide us windows into their philosophies about the nature of the world and their place in it. We feel closer to them when we know that their human concerns were and still ours, even if our answers, our responses have evolved in very different ways. Another way we can appreciate it. The Torah gave birth to a universe of Jewish literature. Rabbis and others have spent now thousands of years interpreting it. Some of their interpretations are really less interpretations than completely creative re-understandings, but they link them to the Torah, or at least they use it as the springboard for this kind of thing. Rabbi Wein used to call it kosherizing. It may not be a legitimate legal principle, but it certainly is something that's a legitimate literary principle. I'm particularly fond of the interpretation of our literature as being a replacement, if you will, for a genealogy. We know that Jews really don't have a bloodline. We're really not one race or ethnicity. We're really not all espousing some kind of unified, comprehensible religious belief. But as has been suggested by really two of the greatest thinkers of modern Jewish times, the Israeli author Amos Oz of blessed memory, and his daughter, the historian Fania Oz Salzberger, we can look at our heritage of written treasures as a text line. In that sense, it's a different kind of genealogy for us, isn't it? It really speaks about all of our ritual and our stories being connected from one piece of literature to another piece of literature to another piece of literature throughout our time. I wrote about this, well, they wrote about it first, I should say that with humility, in a book called Jews and Words. You can find that book really very easily. Just look up Amos Oz, Jews and Words. And I gave a little bit of a punch to that in my, a little bit of punching up to it, at least, in my review of it, which was in the summer 2020 issue of Humanistic Judaism magazine. I provided a link to just that article beneath this YouTube video, so you can go and grab that and read about it. I also want to use this as an opportunity to say we're going to be talking about this in my new class, which is the first real introduction to Judaism that I've done since I've been here, and it's been requested a great deal. It was in our newsletter this week. That's also on our website. You can look that up. I'm calling it Introduction to Jews and Their Judaisms, with an S at the end. And if you want to learn more about the Ozes and their text line and all the different things about what it means to be a Jew and the various ways to be Jewish, I hope you'll join me in that class. It'll start at the end of October and meet on more or less a bi-weekly basis. All right, so advertisement over. We've talked now about the foundational mythology, about how it gave birth to these various texts that continue to be written to this day. Well, what else can we learn from the Torah? It can actually teach us real history. Now, understand what I'm saying. That doesn't mean that the stories in the Torah are true, but the stories in the Torah point to things that really happened. This is something that we talk about in my text study classes all the time. And for those of you who think that Torah study or Bible study is really not something for humanistic Jews, not only is it is so in a much more complex and much more, I think, relevant way. So, for instance, when we read a story about the golden calf, and we learn that it's really about a king and some of the controversial decisions that he made at the time of the story's writing, well, that's just marvelous. I now know something about their politics at the time that this story was written. Or when we take a look at the fact that there are two creation stories. Doesn't look like it, but there are two in the Torah. That's also marvelous because these were written at different times, and they tell us how ancient Israelites changed really radically their way of understanding both their deity and how their deity made the world. This is not something unique to the Jews. Shakespeare did this. Ask most scholars, anyway, about the great play, one of my favorites, Richard III, and they will tell you that it is about a lot of things in Shakespeare's time, but Richard III, who lived before him, is not one of them. Though he tells the story of Richard III, he tells it in a way that's about his own contemporary experience. Knowing all of this about our Torah connects us to ancient times, to this text line, to this way of being Jewish. And all of this is worth rejoicing over, even if we as humanistic Jews are not going back to the customs of dancing with scrolls or raising them up and proclaiming their authorship from God. So I still want to wish all humanistic Jews a very happy Simchat Torah. We should rejoice in this wonderful artifact, this wonderful treasure that gave birth to so many more treasures. We don't have to believe its own theology in order to believe in its importance. That is simply a fact. So let's rejoice in this incredible literary legacy and everything it gave birth to. It was a real gift by our ancestor to us and the world. And as humanists, we have the maturity to celebrate that. Thank you. Excuse me. Now, continuing on in our service, a reading for peace. Now, the prophet Isaiah, who was probably a real person himself, bequeathed us an important link himself in the history of our written treasures. He is famous for a prophecy of a future of peace. This is what he wrote. Let them beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. The poet Yehuda Amichai lived in the 20th century, and he has a place in the history of Jewish literature. He answered Isaiah with these words, "Don't stop beating the swords into plowshares. Don't stop. Go on, beating and making musical instruments out of them. Whoever wants to make war again will have to turn them into plowshares first. In this community where we find strength and common purpose, we turn our minds and hearts to all those who need our love and support, those who are ill, those who suffer pain of the body or spirit, those who are lonely, those who have been wronged. Tonight, we extend our well wishes to these members of our community and their loved ones, to Bernice Bunny Lasker, to Cece Stone, Julie Eliason, Karen Tremper Harris, Myron Tink, Robert Liebhaber, and Andrew O'Donnell. May all who suffer know that they are not alone. May they be healed quickly. May they experience a complete recovery, refuah shlema, the renewal of their bodies and the renewal of their spirits. Our thoughts turn to those who are no longer with us, our own loved ones, those whom our friends and neighbors have lost, the martyrs of our people whose graves are unmarked, and those of every people and nation whose lives have been a blessing to humanity. As we remember them, we meditate on the meaning of loss and love, of life and death. We recall now our loved ones whom death has recently taken from us, those who died at this season in years past, and those whom we have taken into our hearts with our own. Tonight, our congregation mourns the recent death of Elaine Gluckman, Yehi Zichra Livracha, as we also observe the yahrzeits tonight of Mary Feldman, Gerald Primack, Ann Surratt, Jerry Sherbin, George Harris, Leslie Kutinsky, Belle Matthews, Alan Seifer, Henry Crystal, Hilda Gins, Sam Kaplan, Sidney Kaplan, Barbara Luria, and Marion Rose. Yehi Zichram Livracha, may their memories provide a sense of comfort as we go through our lives in their absence. That is our program for tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. A happy Simchat Torah and a Shabbat Shalom to everybody. We're going to conclude with Peace Be With You, a wonderful, rousing song in the spirit of Simchat Torah.
Peace be with you.